For today's perspective, our next guest has spent 5 decades, in his words, travelling around Europe, worrying about Europe and writing about Europe. The product of that is the book Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, by the renowned author and Oxford professor Timothy Garton Ash. It begins with the story of his father's involvement in the Second World War and ends in Ukraine, with a lot packed in between, particularly Europe since 2008, which he describes, quote, as one damn crisis after another. Timothy's with us now.
Good to be with you.
Timothy, let's begin at the beginning. Yeah. As one of your fellow scholars, Lewis Carroll, once said, take us from the beaches of D-Day and what's going on there?
On the 6th of June this year, it will be 80 years since my father landed with the first wave on D-Day, 7:30 a.m. on the Normandy Beaches. A Europe engulfed in war, 60 million dead, dictatorships everywhere. And this book is a story about how Europe gradually recovered, liberated ourselves from dictatorships, also in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Remember, till the early 70s, there were still dictatorships in Western Europe, and became more and more Europe whole and free, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the transitions to democracy in East Central Europe. And then, as you said, since 2008, just a cascade of crises, culminating in the largest war in Europe since 1945. We've just seen the photos of the Russian plane being shot down. Yeah. I've been in Ukraine 4 times since the beginning of the full-scale war. It is, these are scenes from 1945.
With drones added, I guess, and updated aircraft, but essentially you're right, in terms of those fields, the front lines, 1,000 kilometres or so there. Tell us about, this is a question a lot of people get asked and give a different answer to. Where does Europe begin, as far as you're concerned, and end?
Europe doesn't end at any clear line. It merely fades away. It fades away across the vast expanse of Russia, of Turkey, across the Mediterranean, and actually across the Atlantic, because Canada would be a perfect member state of the EU, right? So that there is no clear end to the cultural, historical entity, geographical entity that is Europe. But of course, the political community of Europe is a different matter. If Europe is everywhere, it's nowhere. Right? So it has to end somewhere.
So you talk about Europe as a community, which takes us to a centre of gravity. Now, there's 2 questions in that. Where do you see perhaps Europe as an amorphous sense of the borders edging out, fading out eventually? Where is the centre of gravity perhaps culturally, and where is it within the EU politically?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because I think many French would have a very simple answer. It's clearly in Paris. But actually, the answer today is Berlin. Because of the great eastward enlargement after the fall of the wall, bringing in countries all the way to the Baltic states, and now with the prospect of enlargement to Ukraine, the center of gravity is Berlin. The problem is that we no longer have any strategic leadership coming from Berlin. I don't mean, by the way, that Germany is the hegemon, that it's going to run the whole show, but it's certainly the first among equals.
Tell me about, you mentioned the French, perhaps would argue maybe culturally Paris. I'm sure each state would to their own, but I want to pick you up on that and your view in those 50 years, looking now at President Macron, where he sits within perhaps the European power base compared to his predecessors.
Well, President Macron is one of the few European leaders who thinks geostrategically. And there's been this remarkable change over the last, actually just few years. Until very recently, the French were typically very reluctant to enlarge the EU towards the east, because that meant the center of gravity was going eastwards. In the last, actually, year and a half since the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, Macron has completely turned that round, is now an advocate of the eastward enlargement of NATO and the EU. So he has a strategic vision. What he doesn't have is the power. Actually, to do it, you need Germany, you need Italy, you need Poland, you need, if you like, a coalition of the willing within the EU. And this, for me, is the great challenge of this moment, because we are at the beginning of a new period of European history. The 24th of February 2022 starts a new period of European history, and beginnings really matter.
Tell me what you mean by that.
what we did in the few years after 1945 shaped the European order for the next 40 years. What we did in the few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, end of the Cold War, shaped it for the last 30 years. So what we do this year or next, do we help Ukraine to win or do we let it lose, for example?
Very interesting. When you think about the huge NATO exercise going on right now, the biggest for some time, you have a situation where the head of the British Army right now is talking about having some kind of citizen army, which the government has said wouldn't have to be compulsory, but very clearly saying with other NATO allies there is a present threat from Russia for other countries. Now that's, you take us within that element as well. I just wonder what you talked as well about this sense of one crisis after another since 2008. I think another thing that struck me from the book is actually perhaps preceding that was an optimism about Europe, about where it could go and how that was limited.
Hubris, the Greek word. We were so complacent. Because history had gone our way for so many years, actually since the end of the dictatorships in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, we thought democracy, freedom, rule of law, progress, that was the future. And that was precisely the moment at which history turned and started, so to speak, biting us in the backside. And now we have a real struggle on our hands.
You also talk about a couple of outliers, aside from Russia, within the EU, and particularly, tell me about your thoughts on Viktor Orban in Hungary.
So this is a shocker, because, as you know, I followed the story of the liberation of Eastern Europe very closely at first hand. I knew Viktor Orban as a young man. He was a kind of hero of the liberation.
On the left?
Yeah, but also, as it were, a true liberal, we thought. Gave a heroic speech in 1989 saying the Russian armies have to leave Hungary. Here he is now, Putin's poodle, undermining the EU's support for Ukraine. He has demolished democracy in Hungary. Hungary is no longer a democracy. If we can have a country which is no longer a democracy, which is a full member state of the EU, then the EU is in real trouble, because the EU should be a community of democracies, or it's nothing.
A final point. If readers are looking at this, is there something that they would be... You mentioned many points that are surprising, but is there one thing that surprised you in all of the decades of research, saying you didn't expect and actually just pops out of the book for you?
Well, I'm going to be quite honest with you. I met Vladimir Putin in 1994. Nobody had heard of this guy, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. He was already talking about territories that had always been Russian. He explicitly mentioned Crimea, so the instinct to get the Russian Empire back was there. Though, don't tell me it was the eastward enlargement of NATO. This was 5 years before the eastward enlargement of NATO. But if you say to me, did I expect a full-scale Second World War style military invasion of Ukraine, I'm going to have to be honest and say I didn't. I thought he'd grab a chunk of eastern Ukraine, but that's a real shocker. But that's the world we're in. Frankly, Vladimir Putin is the Adolf Hitler of our day.
Professor Timothy Garton Ash, what an odyssey, 5 decades, going through an incredible book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure.